1:48 a.m. One American battleship is lit up like a burning street. The other is still invisible. Japanese lookouts think the hard part is over. On the hidden ship, one officer says nothing for 3 full seconds. Then he leans toward the plot. Keep tracking. The sea is black. Gun flashes turn it white. For an instant, every mast, every funnel, every wall of spray appears and disappears again. A Japanese gunnery officer smiles into the blast haze. He thinks he is watching the last minutes of an American defeat. Below the hidden American bridge, a radar talker stares at green light and pencil marks. He cannot see the battle. He can only hear it. Steel above him trembles. Someone shouts for a repeat bearing. He gives it. Steady. On the exposed American ship, men are running through red-lit passageways that no longer obey the switches. Phones cut out. Circuits die. A signalman reaches for a handset that has already gone mute. The next shell lands before he can swear. The Japanese line is closing. Battleship. Cruisers. Destroyers. A whole weight of metal moving with the confidence of men who believe the night belongs to them. Ahead, one American silhouette glows in fire. The unseen one is still only a rumor. A loader in a 16-inch turret wipes sweat from his lip and waits for an order that has not come. He can feel the ship turning. He can hear smaller guns somewhere outside. Nobody inside the turret knows if they are about to fire or die in silence. Aboard a Japanese battleship, a young lookout points with both hands. There. He means the blazing American ship. No one asks about the darkness off its flank. The American officer on the hidden bridge watches the night through instruments, not eyesight. He has one damaged friendly ship drawing every enemy barrel. He has one chance to let the enemy keep looking the wrong way. He takes it. The island ahead is still there. Its airfield still matters. Its survival is the reason both fleets are here at all. But for the next few minutes, nobody on either side is fighting for an island. They are fighting for who owns the dark. At 1:48 a.m., Japan thinks it is finishing a battle. It is actually stepping deeper into one. Hours earlier, nothing about the night had felt this narrow. The Japanese had come south with a mission that made brutal sense. Get through, smash the airfield, break the American hold before dawn could bring aircraft down on the transports. Their force carried the kind of weight night battles were built around. A battleship, heavy cruisers, light cruisers, destroyers, long torpedoes, trained lookouts, and officers raised in a navy that still believed darkness rewarded nerve and skill. For months, that belief had often been true. It is why so many men on the Japanese bridges tonight still trust their eyes more than any machine. The Americans had their own reasons to feel tired before the first shot. The waters around the island had already swallowed ships, sleep, and illusions. Men had fought here long enough for place names to stop sounding geographical and start sounding personal. Every approach lane carried memory. Every black horizon line suggested torpedoes, shellfire, or wreckage. The American force that entered this night was not fresh and triumphant. It was bruised, lean, and carrying just enough strength to matter if used perfectly. That "if" hung over every compartment. Rear Admiral Willis Lee understood something that made him unusual even inside his own navy. He did not romanticize the night. He did not believe courage alone could master it. He trusted radar. He trusted gunnery. He trusted disciplined fire control. He trusted the quiet men below decks who built the invisible picture. On another kind of bridge, that would have made him seem clinical. Here, in iron water under a moonless sky, it made him dangerous. He had one great advantage tonight. Most of the Japanese officers who were about to fight him still did not fully understand how a man could command a night battle through electronics and patience. On the Japanese side, the mood was harder, more direct. The Americans had to be stopped. The airfield had to be neutralized. A night action at close range was still a kind of battle many Japanese officers preferred. In daylight, American air power poisoned everything. In darkness, the old hierarchy could return. Good optics, strong torpedoes, aggressive movement, fast recognition. First blows. A senior Japanese officer standing under shielded bridge lights might not have said the word aloud, but many of the men under him felt it. Relief. At last, a fight that belonged to the night again. On USS Washington, a young radar talker named Ben Mercer had never imagined battle would sound this administrative. Repeat bearing. Confirm target angle. Mark speed. Report course change. Everything around him suggested chaos, yet his job required the opposite. He sat hunched over glowing data while the ship itself remained physically untouched. No shells had found them yet, no flames, no screams on deck. Just the cold, almost insulting cleanliness of blips. He knew enough to understand what that meant. The ship remained alive because the enemy had not really seen it. On the American battleship drawing the enemy's attention, nothing felt clean. South Dakota had already become the kind of ship sailors fear most in battle. One still afloat, still armed, still dangerous, but no longer trustworthy to itself. Electrical trouble had begun stripping confidence from the vessel in layers. Circuits failed. Communication degraded. Systems went dark at the worst times. Men were forced to do the ugliest kind of fighting, the kind where a ship remains physically present, but starts losing coordination faster than steel. Inside her, bravery had become manual labor. Across the water, on Kirishima, Lieutenant Hajime Sato worked near the forward fire control team and felt the battle settling into a shape he recognized. American ship located. American ship illuminated. American ship under heavy fire. The pieces were fitting together the way training promised they would. He did not think in slogans or propaganda. He thought in simpler terms. The enemy had been found. The enemy could be measured. The enemy was taking punishment. He could feel confidence moving through the Japanese ship almost physically, like heat. This was the moment veteran night officers trusted. Nobody on either side yet understood that the most important man in the next 7 minutes would not be standing in flame or spotlight. He would be standing in shadow, refusing the temptation to announce himself too soon. The waters off Guadalcanal had already taught terrible lessons to both navies. The Japanese had won in darkness here before. The Americans had bled badly, learning that night vision and courage were not enough. Yet lessons in war are never owned permanently. Tonight, both fleets were arriving with different interpretations of the same campaign. Japan believed darkness still tilted toward the side willing to move inside it. America had begun believing darkness could be measured, shaped, and betrayed. Only one of those beliefs could leave the strait intact. Washington moved like a patient animal. Large, armed with 9 16-inch rifles, carrying radar that made night less pure than the Japanese wanted it to be. She was not in the battle to perform. She was in it to strike once the pattern clarified. Her captain, Glenn Davis, worked under Willis Lee's command. Around them, the ship's company lived inside trained restraint. They were not supposed to chase the first flash. They were not supposed to waste the ship's presence on panic. That discipline is easy to admire after the fact. Inside a warship waiting in the dark, it feels like a physical ache. Ben Mercer kept hearing one detail repeated in different voices. South Dakota. Always South Dakota. Damage reports. Visual references. Gunfire concentrated there. Bearings bending toward her. Mercer understood the implication before anyone had to explain it. The Japanese thought they had found the decisive American target. If Washington remained unlit, unspoken, and unguessed for a little longer, then every enemy shell chasing South Dakota was also buying time for another ship. He drew the contact line again, with a pencil that had gone slick in his fingers. On Kirishima, Sato's world remained visual and immediate. Flash to starboard. Secondary reports from destroyers. Ranges tightening. An American silhouette getting easier to read under shell splashes and bursts of flame. He did not doubt that another American unit might be near. No sane officer would assume only one enemy ship in these waters. But battle trains attention brutally. The visible crisis always feels like the decisive one. Kirishima's guns had a target. Other ships had angles. The Japanese line was pressing. Victory does not usually announce its traps in the middle of its own momentum. A signalman on South Dakota, named Charlie Reddick, found himself staring at instruments that no longer answered the way they had in drills. He was 21, and suddenly older than that. Shipboard battle compresses men into whatever they can do usefully in 10 seconds. Reddick carried messages because the circuits could not be trusted. He took them from one compartment to another while the ship convulsed around him. Somewhere above, enemy shells were still finding steel. Somewhere beyond, someone had to know the ship was not simply fighting the Japanese now. She was fighting her own broken nervous system too. A Japanese destroyer captain in the screen saw the Americans exactly the way a night-fighting officer wanted to see them. Confused, reactive, one ship drawing punishment, one line apparently disordered. He expected the battle to continue tightening around the visible American hulls until the remaining resistance either broke or fled. His torpedoes waited like a second language under the guns. If the battleship fire did not finish the Americans, the destroyer line could help cut off what remained. It looked like the middle of a win. Willis Lee's bridge was quieter than the battle outside. That did not mean calm. It meant concentration stripped down to essentials. Lee had spent years around gunnery and radar. He understood what electronic contact could offer a commander willing to trust it more than his own eyes. He also understood the temptation to fire the instant an enemy shape seemed available. Many officers, confronted with an illuminated friendly ship and active enemy guns, would have fired quickly just to assert presence. Lee kept waiting. He wanted the right ship, and he wanted the Japanese, still looking elsewhere, when the first American salvo arrived. The youngest men aboard Washington did not know that patience could feel like exposure. Every second without firing made the ship seem somehow vulnerable to fate. What if the Japanese finally saw them? What if South Dakota died while Washington remained only a spectator? What if hesitation turned into lost opportunity? These were natural thoughts. Good navies train men to feel them and keep functioning anyway. In Turret 2, a gun captain checked the same ready indicators twice and then stopped himself from checking a third time. He had started listening for permission, the way others listen for thunder. The island ahead mattered because Henderson Field still mattered. If the Japanese could batter it badly enough, their reinforcement and bombardment cycle might open again. If the Americans held it, daylight would keep punishing every surface move that came too close. Both sides knew this. It sat behind every maneuver, every course change, every risk taken in the dark water. Yet the men directly involved in the next decisive moments were not thinking about campaign summaries. They were thinking about line of sight, shell load, bearing changes, power loss, and whether the next hit would land in their own compartment. Charlie Reddick reached a hatchway and almost collided with a wounded petty officer being hauled the other direction. Neither man apologized. There was no space left in the ship for courtesy. Above them, another impact rattled loose metal somewhere overhead. Reddick shoved on, message clenched in hand because the telephones were unreliable and the bridge still needed a body that could move. He did not know that his ship's greatest service to the battle now was simply existing loudly enough to hold Japanese attention. He only knew South Dakota had become the center of everyone else's guns. Sato on Kirishima began to feel something close to satisfaction. The Americans were not disintegrating cleanly. Naval battles almost never grant that convenience. But the pattern was favorable. A major American ship was visible and under pressure. Fire was effective. The night still seemed organized around what Japanese officers could see. On a battleship bridge, confidence accumulates quietly. Men do not cheer. They stop asking certain questions. What Sato was no longer asking was the most dangerous one available to him. Who else is still out there? Ben Mercer kept asking it. He had Washington's plot, the discipline of the chart, and the privilege of not being dazzled by flame. Electronics flatten drama. A burning ship and a dark one can appear on the same scope with similar indifference. Mercer could hear the ship around him, waiting to become visible through violence. He also knew the target track sharpening on the board belonged to a larger answer than panic. When he repeated the bearing again, his voice came out so level it frightened him. If this battle had belonged only to eyes, Japan might have owned the next minutes completely. That is what made the moment so brittle. One side still believed the visible crisis was the real crisis. The other side was preparing to punish that belief with a ship the darkness had not properly introduced yet. South Dakota's problems kept multiplying in human terms. Broken power is one thing in a report. Inside a ship it becomes doors, voices, movement, hesitation, men doubling tasks, people carrying information because electricity has failed to do its share, lookouts struggling with partial data, officers making decisions through gaps instead of channels. That kind of damage strips confidence even when the hull still floats and guns still work. The Japanese saw a bright, suffering battleship and assumed they were breaking American strength. In one sense they were. In another, they were staring at the wrong half of the fight. A loader in Washington's main battery heard a muffled argument beyond the hoists and could not make out the words. He did not need to. He knew what it meant when command voices sharpened and then went still. Decision. The ship had been holding, tracking, measuring. There comes a point in every gunnery action where patience stops being preparation and becomes fire. He wanted that point to arrive now. He feared it too. Firing the first broadside would announce Washington to every enemy ship in range. Once the ship spoke, the dark would answer. On the Japanese side, destroyers and cruisers were also doing what supporting forces always do in moments that later histories flatten. They were screening, reporting, maneuvering through confusion, trying to interpret flashes, avoiding collision, seeking angles, judging friend from foe in a battlefield where shell splashes and smoke kept redrawing the scene. No one aboard them knew they were about to enter an American trap in the theatrical sense. It did not feel theatrical. It felt like battle was proceeding. That is why reversals work. They borrow the enemy's certainty first. Lee asked for confirmation, not because he doubted the picture, because serious men verify before they commit a battleship's full voice to the night. The contact remained large. The range was workable. The geometry favored them. South Dakota was still taking punishment. The Japanese still seemed occupied with what they could see. Lee had waited long enough. He had also waited exactly long enough. Ben Mercer heard the command move through the ship before he understood the full meaning of it. The change in rhythm came first. Men who had been holding themselves in one kind of tension shifted into another. The plotted target was no longer a haunting possibility. It was about to become a set of firing data translated through steel, powder, barrels, and recoil. Mercer did not look up. He looked down harder. He wanted his next report clean. If Washington was about to show itself, it had to do so with certainty. Somewhere above him, huge shells were already being manhandled into consequence. Charlie Reddick, crossing another passageway inside South Dakota, felt a sudden difference in the gunfire outside. Not less. Different. A deeper violence entering from a direction that had not been speaking before. He stopped without meaning to, one hand against hot metal, and realized another major American ship had opened up. The feeling ran through the damaged battleship, like a rumor, before words could catch it. "We are not alone." It was the most important sentence on the American side, and for a few seconds nobody had to say it out loud. Sato heard the first heavy American salvo and knew instantly that the battle had just become more complicated. The sound was different from the smaller clutter around South Dakota, larger, cleaner, more deliberate. It did not come from the broken-looking American ship everyone had been fixing on. For one brief, electric moment, every assumption aboard Kirishima had to reorganize itself around a new fact. There had been another American battleship in the dark, and it had chosen exactly when to speak. The first hits matter physically. The first understanding matters more. A naval crew can survive damage and keep fighting. What erodes performance fastest is the sudden need to revise the world while shells are already arriving. Kirishima's men had been participating in what felt like a tightening victory. Now they were being informed by impacts, splinters, and shock that the night contained a heavier American answer than expected. That is how control begins to crack. Not by fear first, by forced reinterpretation. Washington's main battery did not sound like anger. It sounded like machinery fulfilling itself. Turret after turret fired in sequence. huge rifles turning plotted certainty into impact somewhere invisible beyond the muzzle blast. Inside the gunhouse, men were reduced to practice tasks, stripped of all romantic awareness. Ram, close, fire, vent, reload. The ship shook under its own violence. Outside, black water and muzzle flash combined into the kind of light that makes night battles feel less like darkness and more like fragments of burned photograph. The hidden ship was hidden no longer. Japanese lookouts tried to solve the new shape fast. Another battleship. American, off to one side. Not previously engaged. Fire accurate. Too accurate. Calls passed. Bearings adjusted. Guns sought the source. Yet reacting to a new threat at night is not the same as preparing for one. Kirishima and the ships around her had been mentally and physically angled into a different problem. Now they had to swing a battle already in motion toward a target that had begun firing from advantage, not desperation. Advantage at sea is often only seconds wide. Lee had found his. In South Dakota, the new American fire brought more than relief. It brought confusion of a better kind. Men who had spent the last minutes feeling themselves become the whole battle now felt the pressure distribute outward again. Japanese shells were still coming. Damage still existed. The ship was still in real danger. But there is a profound emotional difference between being the only visible answer and being one wounded piece of a larger response. Charlie Reddick saw it in faces before he heard it in language. Men straightened. Not because safety had arrived, because company had. Sato tried to keep his thoughts technical. Report the bearing. Hold the range. Correct for the new fire source. Do not let shock become delay. He was good enough at his work to know panic serves no instrument. Yet around him the ship itself was beginning to contradict the discipline he wanted to preserve. Damage reports arrived. Structural violence changed the sound underfoot. The old confidence, the one built on controlling the visible American crisis, was already leaving. Japanese crews were now solving Washington instead of finishing South Dakota. A battle can turn the instant one side starts answering instead of dictating. Willis Lee did not need to make the moment larger than it was. He understood its practical shape. The enemy had been drawn toward South Dakota. Washington had retained concealment. Radar had given the line. The firing solution existed. He was not a mythic hero inside his own mind. He was a professional, doing exactly what years of study and discipline said should be done once the conditions aligned. That is what made him so dangerous. He did not need drama. He needed a target, still late to the truth. Ben Mercer's plot kept moving, even while the gunfire above became apocalyptic. He was part of the battle and oddly removed from its spectacle. He saw contacts shift. He heard numbers repeated. He watched a clean mental picture survive where visual battlefields tended to dissolve. There is something almost unfair about that, from the enemy's side. A Japanese officer might still be interpreting flash and silhouette, while an American radar team holds a colder, steadier version of the fight underneath it all. Mercer did not think of fairness. He thought of not being wrong. Washington's fire walked through Kirishima with the kind of precision that feels cruel because it is so methodical. Heavy shells struck high, low, amidships, through upper works, into structure and systems. Secondary batteries joined. The Japanese battleship that had entered the action expecting to help finish an exposed American opponent now became the center of catastrophic attention. Damage in a battleship is never just metal penetration. It is command interruption, sightline collapse, human noise, partial blindness, forced improvisation. The night advantage Japan had counted on was being used against it. A Japanese destroyer captain, who moments earlier had been preparing for the next stage of a victory, now found his world split between orders, gun flashes, possible torpedo opportunities, and a growing sense that the flagship battle unit was in trouble. Supporting ships in night actions live inside uncertainty, amplified by obedience. You do not always understand the whole shape. You understand the violence nearest you and the need to respond. He glanced once toward the heart of the firing and saw enough to know the American answer was heavier than anyone had wanted. Charlie Reddick finally reached a compartment where an officer could take his message and realized the man was half deaf from concussion. The officer took the paper anyway. Outside, Washington kept firing. Reddick did not know her exact position. He did not know who was on her bridge or what instrument had guided her. He only knew the Japanese line that had felt like a fist closing around his ship was no longer closing. It was flinching. Under battle conditions, flinching is a kind of mercy. For the first time in too many minutes, he thought the ship might survive the night. Sato's world aboard Kirishima began shrinking. This happens in damaged warships. The larger battle disappears behind the immediate demands of survival and response. A man who entered an action as part of a powerful formation finds himself trapped inside corridors of information no wider than the nearest hit, the nearest shouted bearing, the nearest failed system. He still knows the battle exists. He can no longer inhabit it fully. Washington's achievement was not only damage, it was enclosure. The Japanese were being forced inward by a ship they had barely noticed soon enough. Some victories die before anyone formally announces the reversal. They die in tone, in how fast commands are repeated, in the way men stop assuming their next instruction will be offensive, in how a bridge begins asking what has been hit instead of what will be hit next. At 1:48, the Japanese side had felt like the owner of the action. Now that ownership was gone. Not gradually. Brutally. Lee had not saved an American ship by patching it, rescuing it, or shielding it in some sentimental way. He had saved it by changing where the enemy's certainty lived. That is the colder, truer form of command in battle. Move the enemy's mind, and you move his guns. Move his guns, and you move the fate of every man under them. Washington's bridge remained disciplined, even as the battle swung. Nobody there had the luxury of admiring what was happening. Night action punishes self-congratulation faster than almost anything in war. Return fire could still come. Torpedoes still existed. Other Japanese ships still moved in darkness. Lee kept the action technical. Continue tracking. Continue firing. Continue using the advantage for as long as the advantage remains real. Ben Mercer heard the steadiness in the orders and understood why some officers change battles. They prevent emotion from arriving early. On Kirishima, men who had come to the fight expecting to break American resistance were now trying to keep their own ship coherent under devastating fire. Sato crouched, rose, reported, listened, and kept being interrupted by the physical fact that a battleship under accurate heavy gunfire is a collapsing argument. Structure, command, visibility, and confidence begin failing together. No officer ever wants to feel this truth in his own hull. The other man solved you before you solved him. The Japanese night had turned hostile. Charlie Reddick climbed toward a higher platform and caught his first real glimpse across the water since the worst of South Dakota's punishment began. He saw flashes farther off, not from his own ship. Great blunt bursts. He saw something larger beyond the immediate chaos, something firing with deliberate rhythm, rather than the spasmodic violence of a damaged vessel under pressure. He had no tactical vocabulary for it in that second. He only understood the emotional fact of it. Someone else had entered the room carrying a bigger hammer. Aboard Washington, the gun crews lived inside repetition so practiced it seemed detached from the enormity outside. The human body can perform almost peacefully in the middle of mass destruction if training has narrowed the task enough. Shell, hoist, ram, close, fire, recoil, reset. Around these motions hung the entire hinge of the battle, yet the men doing them could focus only on procedure. That is one of war's strangest mercies. It protects the mind by localizing it. History later remembers the broadside. In the turret, men remember the next action, then the next. The Japanese formation around Kondo had entered the night with a mission broader than killing one or two enemy ships. It needed the bombardment path open. It needed the island's airfield punished. It needed American interference broken quickly enough for the larger operational purpose to remain alive. Once Washington's intervention began tearing Kirishima apart, the whole mission started losing time and shape. This is what tactical surprise does best. It steals the enemy's larger reason while he is still busy trying to survive the local shock. A battle need not sink every ship to ruin a plan. It only needs to shatter the timing. Sato heard a report he did not want to hear because it made too much sense. Another American battleship. Not just another ship. Not just stray fire. A battleship. The word clarified everything too late. Too much weight. Too much accuracy. Too much punishment for a ship that had been engaged from the dark while attention sat elsewhere. He felt, more than thought, the ugly conclusion behind it. They had mistaken the visible American crisis for the whole American force. Night had favored the wrong reader. Lee's decision is often summarized too cleanly afterward, as if he simply waited, fired, and won. Inside the moment, it was messier and more impressive than that. He had to resist the urge to speak too soon. He had to trust radar over instinct. He had to let a friendly ship suffer visible punishment while preserving the unseen ship's leverage. He had to choose not the first shot, but the decisive shot. Plenty of officers are brave in battle. Fewer can be patient while a friendly vessel burns under enemy fire. That patience is what changed the night. Ben Mercer finally looked up for a single second between reports. He saw almost nothing coherent. Flash, smoke, darkness. A shape where a ship should be. Then blackness again. The eye told him a battle was chaos. The scope told him the chaos had structure. He looked back down immediately. He belonged to the second truth now. Whatever story men later told about heroism on the bridge, Mercer knew the battle had also been won in places no Japanese lookout could ever see. Charlie Reddick felt South Dakota's damage all around him and still knew the ship had become part of a larger success. That is another kind of battlefield irony. Men may be bleeding, blinded, half cut off from their own circuits, and still be contributing enormously to victory just by drawing the enemy's certainty to the wrong place. Reddick did not think of himself that way. He thought of surviving until dawn. Yet his ship's ordeal had purchased the darkness Washington needed. History is full of sacrifices that do not look noble inside the compartment. On Kirishima, the question was no longer how to finish the Americans. It was how to remain Kirishima long enough to matter. Damage changes the personality of a ship. A warship begins an action as an instrument. Under heavy, accurate fire, it becomes a crisis full of small private worlds. Flooding, fire, broken communication, confused sectors, local acts of discipline, local acts of courage. Sato kept doing his duty because men do, even while the shape of defeat enters around them. He no longer thought about the island's airfield. He thought about the next impact. The Japanese officers, who had felt victory nearest, were among the men hurt most by the reversal. A clean loss is one thing. A victory interrupted in mid-breath is another. Just minutes earlier, an exposed American battleship had seemed to validate every old night-fighting confidence. Now a different American ship, guided by what could not be seen with the naked eye, had transformed that confidence into vulnerability. Such moments do more than break formations. They break inheritance. They tell experienced men the rules they trusted are aging faster than they admitted. Washington's fire did not have to continue forever. It only had to continue long enough. That is another hard lesson in command. Tactical genius is often the art of arriving at exactly enough violence in the right minute, not maximum violence in every minute. Lee had chosen his entrance. His ship had inflicted catastrophic damage. The Japanese bombardment plan was unraveling. Every additional second remained dangerous for everyone. Battleships are not invisible after they fire. Torpedoes still haunt dark water. Other enemy ships still search for revenge. The question had already shifted from "Can Washington change the battle?" to "Has she changed it enough?" Ben Mercer sensed that shift before hearing it voiced. Plots change flavor when attack becomes exploitation and exploitation becomes extraction. Bearings still matter. Contacts still move. Yet command attention begins widening again, reassessing not merely the target, but the whole surviving battlefield. Mercer's pencil moved more carefully now. In the early chaos, he had been helping create a precise answer. Now he was helping determine how long the answer remained safe to keep using. The hidden work of battle never stops at the broadside. Charlie Reddick finally had a moment in which no one nearby was immediately shouting. Into that sudden pocket of lesser noise came a thought almost too private to admit. He had expected to die inside the ship before the night ended. Not nobly. Not in a scene worthy of history. Just somewhere in heat and broken light and failed wiring. That expectation began loosening for the first time when Washington's guns found the dark. Relief in battle is often quieter than fear. It feels embarrassed to exist. Sato realized their confidence had been used against them. That is one of the bitterest military sensations. Not being beaten in spite of your strengths, but being beaten through them. The Japanese had done what experienced night forces do: seize the visible enemy, press hard, exploit confusion, trust the old grammar of darkness. Lee had counted on exactly that. Washington's invisibility mattered because South Dakota's visibility was irresistible. Kirishima had not been surprised by luck alone. She had been surprised by patience. Sato could respect that even while it destroyed his ship. Somewhere between the first accurate Washington salvos and the decision to break away, the battle stopped being about a single heroic save and became something harsher. One officer had read the night differently. One ship had entered late and exactly. One damaged ship had unknowingly carried the enemy's gaze long enough. One radar team had kept the unseen picture straight. One set of crews had turned decision into metal without error. The night turned because many disciplines held under a few unbearable minutes. Lee simply understood when to spend them. The Japanese withdrawal instinct did not arrive dramatically. It arrived as recognition that the bombardment mission was failing, that Kirishima was crippled, that darkness no longer guaranteed advantage, and that staying longer risked converting a frustrated operation into a worse catastrophe. Withdrawal in battle is often misdescribed as cowardice by people who have never stood inside the arithmetic. Here it was arithmetic. A force built to strike Henderson was now fighting for coherence under an American answer it had not timed correctly. The night had stopped paying. Washington's men were not cheering. They were too busy, too trained, too aware of what could still happen. Yet something had changed in the ship's body. The ache of waiting was gone. The fear of remaining silent while another American battleship burned was gone. In its place was the colder steadiness that follows effective action. A big ship feels different when her guns have spoken successfully, not triumphant, aligned. The crew could feel they had crossed from possibility into consequence. Charlie Reddick looked across damaged steel and thought of nothing as grand as victory. He thought about morning, about whether light would reveal them afloat, about whether the men missing from the last passageway were dead or only elsewhere, about whether the ship could still answer helm and power and command in some reliable way. Battle is never as neat for the survivors as it later becomes on a map. South Dakota had not been rescued into comfort. She had been spared destruction by timing, distraction, steel, and another ship's intervention. That was enough. Sato, surviving inside a ship no longer likely to shape the night in Japan's favor, experienced the war's newer truth in its cruelest form. An American battleship he barely saw in time had used a technology many Japanese officers still treated as secondary to visual skill and turned it into decisive violence. Not because optics no longer mattered, not because courage no longer mattered, but because the old order of night battle, see, judge, strike, was no longer sovereign. Another order had entered the Pacific, one in which darkness could be measured and weaponized by the man who trusted instruments enough to wait. That was the true wound. Lee's bridge did not need speeches. The result spoke clearly enough. Kirishima was effectively broken. The bombardment thrust had failed. The Americans had survived a night that might have reopened disaster on Guadalcanal. All of that mattered strategically. Yet the emotional truth remained smaller and sharper. At the worst moment, when one American battleship seemed to be taking the whole Japanese Navy on her decks, Lee had refused panic. He had held his second ship in the dark and fired only when the enemy's certainty had fully committed itself elsewhere. Command is often just disciplined timing under moral pressure. Ben Mercer finally exhaled and discovered he had been rationing breath. Below decks, nobody was going to compose a grand interpretation of the battle. They had more work to do. Reports to update, damage to understand, contacts to maintain, until the danger had truly passed. Yet Mercer would remember one detail years later more clearly than all the noise above. Not the firing itself, not even the hits, the moment before it. The strange professional stillness on the bridge and in the plotting spaces when the ship decided to become visible. That was the hinge. In the Japanese line, men began leaving the battle carrying a new kind of memory. Not simply that an enemy battleship had fired accurately, that they had been allowed to believe the visible American problem was the whole American answer. Night fighting had always been psychological. Every officer knew that. But this was a new injury. Their own success against South Dakota had helped blind them to Washington long enough for Washington to decide the battle. No veteran forgets a lesson learned at that price. The island remained. That fact, more than any one sunk or damaged ship, is what made the night historic. Henderson Field would not be smashed by the bombardment this force had come to deliver. Guadalcanal would continue choking Japanese attempts to retake the initiative. Campaigns do not turn only on courage. They turn on whether one side reaches dawn with its operational purpose intact. Japan would not. America would. And somewhere inside that campaign-sized truth was a very small, very human one. A man had waited 3 extra seconds in the dark. Charlie Reddick found himself on a section of deck where the air finally moved. Smoke, cordite, and scorched paint still lived everywhere, but the ship had stopped feeling like a sealed furnace. He looked out over water that had been death a short while before and was now merely black again. Somewhere beyond it lay the American battleship he had never properly seen during the action, only felt through the changed pattern of enemy shell fire. He would never forget that feeling. The battle turning by sound before it turned by sight. Sato, if he survived the war to tell the story, would not have described Willis Lee as myth. He would have described him as the kind of opponent every Navy fears at the edge of technological transition. A man traditional enough to understand the old battle, modern enough to trust the new means of mastering it, and disciplined enough not to reveal his hand before the other side had committed to the wrong reading. Those officers are rare because they require 2 temperaments that do not often coexist. Aggression, restraint. Lee had both. Washington herself never needed to dominate the entire night to change it. She needed a window. A damaged friendly ship created it. Japanese confidence widened it. Radar defined it. Lee recognized it. Gunnery executed it. History often pretends such moments are simpler than they were. In truth, they are chains. Remove one link, and the broadside comes too early, too late, or not at all. This is why the title does not say, "One American officer won Guadalcanal." That would be childish. The island had been bleeding into decision for months. Marines, sailors, pilots, mechanics, transports, coast watchers, destroyermen, and men who never expected fame had all carried part of its weight. Yet there are nights inside campaigns when one officer's reading of one moment changes what the next morning will mean. This was one of them. At 1:48 a.m., Lee did not save the war. He saved the minute that kept the campaign alive. By dawn, the story was already being simplified by survival. Kirishima, mortally damaged. Japanese bombardment broken. South Dakota battered but afloat. Washington, intact enough to remain a presence rather than a casualty. Men count outcomes because outcomes are easier to hold than the interior of battle. Fair enough. But the interior matters. The blackout, the wrong target fixation, the trust in optics, the silent radar room, the damaged ship serving as unwilling bait, the officer who refused to announce himself too soon. Those are the parts that explain why one side left the night intact enough to keep the island. If a young sailor on Washington had asked Lee afterward what exactly changed the battle, the honest answer would not have sounded poetic. Timing. Not luck alone. Not machines alone. Not bravery alone. Timing shaped by training. Timing protected by patience. Timing spent with conviction once the picture was right. People often imagine decisive command as a dramatic shout. Sometimes it is the refusal to speak too soon, followed by a simple order given only when every cost of waiting has finally bought more than every cost of firing. Charlie Reddick, years later, might remember South Dakota not as a symbol, but as a place of hot passageways, dead phones, running feet, shouted bearings, the sickening awareness that enemy fire had found the ship and would not easily let go. He might also remember the precise second the battle's tone changed, not when he saw Washington, but when Japanese shells and attention started moving elsewhere. That is how most men experience salvation in combat, indirectly, through the behavior of the enemy. Sato's memory, if he carried it home, would probably have centered on a different betrayal. Not of courage, of sequence. First, the Americans seemed broken. Then the unseen battleship announced itself. Then the whole night had to be reread under fire. What Japanese officers had believed was the end of an American defeat turned out to be the middle of an American counterstroke. Few battlefield experiences are more corrosive than discovering the scene has lied to you in its moment of greatest apparent clarity. Guadalcanal did not turn because one side suddenly became braver. Both sides had brave men in abundance. It turned because bravery on one side remained tied to what the eye could dominate, while on the other side, one officer was willing to let electronics, restraint, and timing rewrite what darkness meant. Washington was not merely another heavy ship entering the fight. She was a different theory of the fight entering late enough to matter most. And theory, when timed correctly, can feel like ambush. At 1:48 a.m., Japan thought it had found the heart of the American line. It had found the wound. The heart was still in the dark. When Willis Lee finally let that hidden heart speak, the night changed shape faster than Japanese confidence could recover. South Dakota stopped being the end of an American defeat and became the screen behind which another battleship had been waiting. Kirishima stopped being the instrument of a bombardment and became the victim of a lesson the Pacific was teaching all its survivors. The dark no longer belonged to the man who saw the fire first. It belonged to the man who understood what still had not been seen. So that is the micro-story inside the larger battle. Not just who sank whom, not just which ship took how many hits, but how, in the worst visible moment for the Americans, one officer refused to let the visible moment decide the war around him. He let the enemy believe what the enemy most wanted to believe. Then he used the unseen ship, the unseen plot, and the unseen patience of his crew to break the battle at the exact point where Japanese certainty had become exposure. The island ahead survived the night. So did the campaign, because at 1:48 a.m., one American officer understood that sometimes the fastest way to seize a battle is to let the other side think it already has it.